Welcome to the second lesson in our course, War and Storytelling in Ukraine. Now, in the first lecture, if you missed that, please make sure you go back and watch it. That sets the summary for this course and what you're going to be learning. But in this one, what I want to do is spend some time to talk about the principles of storytelling. And I'm going to talk both about the principles of storytelling broadly, but also how those principles of storytelling relate to war. And this talk should give all of you, I know in this room, a lot of you are journalism students and you might know some of the principles, but I wanted to review the principles of storytelling specifically as it relates to war, give you a few examples from this current war in Ukraine, and allow you to use that to build some inspiration for your final project in this course, which is to tell a story that's worthy of putting out there to the world in media on the war. So that's it. That's what we're going to be covering today. And first of all, before we get into it, I want to give you some general thoughts that I've developed over the years about storytelling. And I've taught storytelling online for the last several years to business owners, digital marketing, agency owners, and regular business owners who want to use storytelling to help get their message out there. And in that exploration of storytelling, the best book I think I've ever come across about storytelling is Homo Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. He's a professor of history at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in his book, he examines the history of mankind and how did Homo sapiens rise up and become the dominant species on the planet. And it's a really interesting story. We are not biologically the smartest, or we're not the most fit species on the planet, but the way we evolved as humans, what is our superpower? What makes us dominant? If we get into a fight on the plains of Africa with many animals, most of them we're going to lose. Okay, what enabled us to form societies that allowed us to create hunting, to basically evolve as human beings? And he comes up with a fascinating conclusion that's probably not completely obvious until you dive into his book. And he says that what makes humans unique is really our ability to tell stories. And our ability to tell ourselves stories and each other stories, and the way that system is developed from oral storytellers before the written word came into being, to systems of writing down stories, and then obviously that's evolved over the years to multimedia, social media, the world that we live in today. And he basically makes the argument that our ability to tell stories as human beings is what connects us together to each other in families, intimate relationships, one-on-one, within families, within communities, within villages, cities, tribes, nations. Story is the most powerful element. It's like the operating system for humanity. And he said humans think in stories, and we try to make sense of the world by telling each other stories. And if you think about, I'm going to walk you through an exercise here in a moment. What is a story? This reminds me of an exercise that I used to take all of my cadets through at West Point. So I used to teach history at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and all the cadets who came in their first year, they went through 6 weeks of basic training, 6.5 weeks of basic training, really intense training over the summer. And one of the things that's drilled into their head is the honor code, because in military, in war, one of the fundamental powerful elements of a combat unit is truth. Do you tell the truth to your boss? about the real state of the situation on the battlefield? Do you tell the truth to your boss about whether your vehicles are actually working? Do you tell the truth to your boss about whether or not you've actually fired your weapons and all of your soldiers really know how to fire their weapons or not? And they drill into your head this idea that you have to be honest. You have to tell the truth to your boss. And they say a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those who do. Not only will you not personally do it, but if you see someone else doing it, you're not going to tolerate that. You're going to turn them in. That's a very controversial part of the honor code at West Point, but it's something that they've put in place to prevent cheating scandals, which have happened over the years at West Point, where people turn a blind eye when they see a systematic problem. And so cadets, they're very scared. They get into their class. They've been yelled at the whole summer, all the time. They're taught to never tell a lie, to always be honest, and that's drilled into their heads. And they get into the class, and I start the class, and I'd say, okay, get up, and I want every one of you to tell me why you came to West Point. Why did you sign up to be a military officer? And they would get up, and they'd tell their story. And they'd say, well, my father was in Vietnam, or my grandfather was in World War II. We have a family tradition of service, and that's why I decided to come to West Point. Or, I got recruited to play football, and I thought it would be great to not only play football, but also serve my country. And everyone had these nice little stories that were 30 seconds long. I would call it your elevator pitch for who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. And they would all, they were still scared because they'd been yelled at the whole summer. I was an officer that was a major at the time, and that outranked them by a lot. So they were still trying to figure out, well, who's this guy teaching us history on the first day of class? And I said, okay, that's interesting. All of them got to tell their story. I said, fine, I want all of you to stand up. We're going to march ourselves down to Ninninger Hall, which is the honor committee, which is where the cadets judge each other in honor cases. I said, I'm going to turn every single one of you in. Well, actually, you're going to turn yourself in for lying. Because every one of you told me why you're here and what you're doing, but it was a lie. And their faces would drop. And some of them actually believed me. They thought that they were going to go and maybe get kicked out of the academy. And then very quickly, I said, okay, I'm just joking, because I felt like I'd killed some of their puppy dogs there. And I said, look, the reason why you're all lying and why I said that is your story that you told me is not really true. It's not 100% true. Some of you are here because your older brother, always dominated you through your family, and you're here to prove something. Some of you are here because your mom didn't give you enough attention as a child, and the military seems like a great place to stay away from girls, right? Broadly, because only 10% of the academy was women. Some of you are here because your father was larger than life, and he was in the military, and you're here to prove yourself to him. Some of you are here because your father ran out when you were 5 years old, okay? And you've always been taking care of your mom and everyone else around you, and you're here to prove yourself. And the point I was trying to make to them was, most of you don't even know why you're here. Most of you have no idea why you're really here, and therefore your story isn't true. It's a little bit true. Yes, your grandfather was in World War II, and yes, that's part of the reason why you're here. But that's just what you choose to tell people. And then I took them through another thought exercise. I said, if I really wanted to understand why you're here, I should sit down and actually interview you about your whole life and ask you everything. And then, how long could you actually talk and tell me about your whole life? You're 18 years old. In theory, you should be able to talk for 18 years. But actually, you'd probably run out of things to say maybe in an hour, maybe two. We could actually dive deep. We could look through your books. I could ask you questions. Maybe we could stretch it out to a day or two. But that's it. You'd be exhausted. You really can't remember everything about your life. So why is it that even after a couple days of in-depth interviews, that you'd run out of things to say? Because you're 18 years old. See the difference here. The problem is to research your life and come up with an accurate reason for why you're really here. You actually are lost in your own story. And is your story actually the only thing that I should consider? What about your mom's story? What about your brother's story? What about your ex-girlfriend's story? Well, don't go there, right? Don't ask her about me. What about your little brother? What about the bully who used to beat you up on the playground? What about all these other people who know you? What would they say about you? And that's just one person. There's 6 billion, 9 billion people on the planet now. Multiply the complexity of what your story is by 9 billion people, how everyone interacts with each other at any one time, and do you see how infinitely complex history is? Storytelling is. It's so imprecise, it's so untrue that storytelling is really frustrating. Because we cannot come up with absolute truth, what do we do as human beings? We invent stories about ourselves. We invent stories about each other, about groups, about families, about communities, about countries. And it's really our method of dealing with ourselves. And I like to say your story isn't true, but is it useful? Is your story somewhat based in fact? Do you have the facts generally right? Because if you're not dealing with facts, if you lie about the fact that you actually, plagiarized 70% of your papers in university, like some people do, you guys were just telling me about, or that you actually didn't graduate from a military academy that you say you graduated from, or you completely lie about facts that people can actually check, then your story isn't true at all. It's fantasy, right? And this idea that I got, this was actually from Dr. Yanni Katsonis, who taught me history at New York University. He said history is just fact-based fiction. History is fact-based fiction. Your story is just fact-based fiction. It's what you choose to emphasize about your life. Take two people, and I've met people like this, we've all met people like this. Father's an alcoholic, abusive drunk, or whatever, and you've got one person who says, well, because my father was an alcoholic, abusive drunk, I'm basically going to do the same thing because that's the example I've seen in my life. Then you have the exact same situation with another person, and that person says, well, because my father's an alcoholic drunk, I'm never going to drink in my life, and I'm never going to do that, and I'm a complete health fanatic. You've all met people like that. We've all experienced certain things. We've all had challenges in our lives, some of us early in childhood, some of us later in life. But what you choose to tell everyone and yourself about those things that happen creates your story. Do you treat yourself as a victim based on the facts, the hard things that happen to you in your life? Or do you say, because these bad things have happened in my life, therefore that makes me who I am? Ukraine right now is a nation. Because we are at war, we're strong. That's the general attitude Ukrainians are telling themselves and each other. And that makes us special. That makes us who we are. That's why Ukraine still exists as a country. Right? So how you choose to interpret everything that happens to you in your life, and if you lie to yourself about the facts of your life, that's fantasy, that's dangerous. But what story you choose to tell yourself and other people about everything that's happening to you as an individual, as a family, as a group, as a society, that is actually an exercise in fiction. Your story, Ukraine's story, the story of this war, believe it or not, is complete fiction. The question is it useful? Is the story that we're telling ourselves as Ukrainians, is the story that you're telling yourselves as Ukrainians, is the story the world is telling themselves about what's happening in Ukraine, is it useful for history? Is it useful for the history of the world? Are we taking the right lessons? Are we going to avoid nuclear war and nuclear Armageddon, or create it with our actions? Because this war isn't over yet, and the things that we tell ourselves about what's happening now and what will happen in the future can actually create very different histories for the world. Not just for Ukraine, because the stakes of Ukraine in this war are too high. The world can try to look away and wish for peace, but it's, how the peace happens is critical to creating conditions where this doesn't happen again, not just in Ukraine, but in other countries, in Taiwan, in the Baltic states, everywhere else. So that's the complexity of storytelling. Is your story true, or is it fantasy? Because some people like to deal in fantasy. And then secondly, is it useful? Right? Because it's never going to be completely true, but is it based on facts? And what facts are you emphasizing? And does that make it useful for you, for you as an individual, as a community, as a family, as a country? So now that we've established how frustrating it is to deal with stories, we're all here. What is storytelling? So this is the set of Star Wars in 1977. This is George Lucas and Mark Hamill, Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker on the set of Star Wars. And everyone now knows Star Wars to be the most valuable film ever created. I mean, there's nine feature films in Star Wars, and all the books and merchandise that's been spun off of that. But people actually forget that the original Star Wars was actually destined for failure. If you look at the film in terms of when it was supposed to launch, it was on the worst weekend of the year in the United States, just at a few thousand theaters. No one thought this was going to be a big hit. Okay, George Lucas was the only one delusional enough to go through with it, and he said, well, I'm going to make this a big hit. And the reason why he made it a big hit was he sat down with a man named Joseph Campbell, and he basically took the script for storytelling, which Joseph Campbell had created, and he made it into a science fiction thriller. And I say this, I like to joke about this, because name for me another movie, sorry to Mark Hamill, who's supporting Ukraine really well in United 24, but name another movie he's ever starred in that's been popular. Okay? The only one who's actually gone on to do other things in other movies was Harrison Ford, who, by the way, was a last-minute addition to the film. Carrie Fisher, Mark Hamill, none of these characters actually, let's face it, did great acting in other places. But the reason why the movie did so well was because it was hard to mess up, and that's because George Lucas took the script of storytelling and he put it into the movie. He just made it science fiction. And this was actually a book called The Power of Myth, where Joseph Campbell, who George Lucas used his script, he took every single story that had ever been written from ancient Greek history, Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad, the Bible. He took everything that had ever been written, every successful work of literature, and he said, what is the common thread for stories that are successful? What makes stories that just take off, like Harry Potter, like all these things? What do they have in common? What is this thing that makes stories just go viral? And this is the book he came up with. And George Lucas read that book and he devoured it. And he just put it into a science fiction movie. And he took a really bad cast of actors who never did anything aside from Star Wars well. And they did it because it worked because of the story. And that's the reason why Star Wars took off. And I'm going to go through that, and I'm just going to share with you the hero's journey, the 12 basic steps. And there's a lot more complexity to this if you read The Power of Myth. But there's basically 12 steps that makes Luke Skywalker so powerful in that first trilogy. Okay, some of you may have been not even born when that came out, but it was definitely in my childhood. So I'll talk about the first three. And I'm going to give that example because a lot of the people who might watch this will probably be my age and really resonate with it. So first of all, limited awareness of the problem, or that's the description of it, the ordinary world. Okay, we all have this blissful ignorance, innocence, before we go on some adventure in our lives. And for Luke, he's just a farm boy on a dusty little planet out in the middle of nowhere in a galaxy, and he's just blissfully ignorant. He has his parents, or the people he thinks are his parents, raising him. He knows they're not his parents, but he's fine. He's a happy-go-lucky guy. All right, that's the ordinary world. And the second step is the call to adventure. So Luke, all of a sudden, he stumbles upon this droid, R2-D2, who presses a button, and out comes this hologram of this beautiful, mysterious woman named Princess Leia, who's talking about this big adventure far away. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. Who is this person? Who is she? What help do I need? He has this spark which says, I need to go on this adventure. There's a bigger world out there that I've never encountered. I had no idea about it, and all of a sudden I know it. And that's that call to adventure, that spark, and this can happen to you many times in your life. I mean, think about weight loss or quitting smoking or something else like that. All of these things in your life can become mini heroes' journeys. And these are just journeys of changing something in your life, getting better, getting rid of old habits and getting something new. So the third step in any hero's journey is this reluctance, this refusal of the call. Because the biggest thing that scares humans more than death even, they've studied this, is actually called change. Nobody likes to change anything in their lives, to the point where people almost let themselves get close to death or even die before they'll change, like quitting smoking or getting healthy or doing something like this, because we hate change. And Luke Skywalker finds out there's this great big adventure out there, but he needs to leave, and he can't leave because his parents or his adopted parents need him to be on the farm. He's too important. He doesn't want to go out and give up this life. Change is really uncomfortable. Okay, then he meets a mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi. All right, Alec McGuinness, he's the other actor that actually did something outside of Star Wars, but not a huge part in the trilogy. So Obi-Wan Kenobi is this mentor, and he brings him to this point where he says, okay, I want to do this adventure. No, I'm scared, but now I have a mentor. I'm going to go out and do this because the mentor's here to help me. And then that takes you across the threshold. You cross the threshold, and this is called leaving the ordinary world, committing to change. And Luke Skywalker's point, it's committing to a brand new adventure. He's on the Millennium Falcon. He's left the planet. His parents are killed, or his adopted parents are killed. He can't go back. There's nothing for him to go back to. The farm's destroyed. Family's dead. Boom, I'm on a spaceship flying out into the galaxy. There's no going back. You've burned the boats at the beach, figuratively speaking. So then you have tests, enemies, allies, and he starts to realize there's stormtroopers out there fighting him, trying to kill him, and he finds this thing called a lightsaber, and he learns how to swing it. There's some initial victories. They blow up the Death Star in the first episode. Great. Okay? This is a trilogy, so the first episode ends with part 5. Something really exciting. They win. But then, boom, as soon as you win something, it gets tougher. Right? You start to approach that innermost cave, and you're seeing, wow, I had some great success. I blew up a Death Star. I know how to use my lightsaber, but that's not enough. And it gets tougher and tougher. And then he realizes, wait a minute, Darth Vader's my father, and I just fought him. He cuts off my hand, and I'm sitting here hanging, and I find out he's my father, and boom, I'm dropping into this, literally like you think he's going to die at that moment. And that's where you approach this mini death, this ordeal, this death, this rebirth. And he comes back stronger. He has a new hand, and then he goes through the last steps. He returns, Return of the Jedi. I mean, 3 episodes, a trilogy, just textbook follows Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? And that's why it's so powerful, because it's easy, and when we see that, what does that remind us of? It reminds us of the Bible. Literally, Jesus dies, comes back to life. That's why Christianity spreads across the world like wildfire, because the story is so powerful, right? Why is Judaism the oldest religion? Why does Israel survive in the middle of the Middle East? Because, man, they know stories really well. They've got a great story. Okay? I mean, look at all the empires that have smashed their teeth on, the Assyrians, the ancient, all these empires that have literally tried to destroy it, all the way up to Hitler. Judaism, and then boom, it's still alive, and it's a really powerful state in the middle of a bunch of people that still don't love it in that neighborhood. But it's because they understand the power of storytelling. There's no accident, I think, that Yuval Noah Harari, wrote *Sapiens*, because Judaism particularly understands intrinsically the power of story. The president of Ukraine comes from that faith, right? So let's look at President Zelensky in the ordinary world, okay? That's President Zelensky playing his piano with a penis. Just for those of you wondering, yes, that's a really interesting skit. And this is President Zelensky 2016 at Kvartal 95. And I remember when my wife and I first met, she used to watch this television show, and I'm thinking, like, who is this kind of weird guy who does these crazy skits? And she's laughing. I have no idea what's going on. Well, this one, you don't need to understand Russian or Ukrainian or anything to understand how funny that one is. Funny enough about this skit, you know what President Putin calls Zelensky dismissively? The piano man, right? Because this skit was so funny, and obviously, Zelensky had a lot of fans in Russia too, and President Putin derisively looking down on President Zelensky's like, this is my opposite number, the piano man. Are you kidding me? This is the guy that you think's going to fight back against me? So that's President Zelensky. He's a comedian. And if you look at his career, his call to adventure is the movie Servant of the People and getting elected president of Ukraine. He gets this idea playing the president on television that actually, you know what? I could just actually run for president. And people are used to seeing me on television as president, and they want change. And I remember watching his speech on January 1st, 2019, of President Zelensky announcing that he was going to run for president. And he gets 73% of the vote. Becomes president in 2019. So that's his call to adventure. If you think about President Zelensky within the context of where he is right now, look at this. I mean, it's a textbook story of a comedian becoming president. And people think that the profession of being a comedian is a joke. That's their job. They tell jokes. But actually, ever since the ancient world, some of the most valuable people in society have been comedians. The court jester was actually the only person in the ancient world who could come and tell the emperor how screwed up they were, because he did it by being funny, right? Because comedy is actually a way, if you think about it, to look at yourself in a way that's not painful. Not so painful that you can't look at it. Why do we tell jokes? Because most of them have some truth to it. But it's a way to say it in a way that we can look at ourselves. And Joe Rogan talks about this all the time, which is being a successful comedian is one of the hardest jobs in the world. There's maybe, he thinks, 50 to 100 really, really good comedians in the English language, at least, who are actually worth following. And everyone else is just pretending. And the reason why being a comedian is so hard is making someone laugh is the hardest thing it's one of the highest skills linguistically, right? To have a sense of humor, there's a reason why women especially like people with a sense of humor, because it's a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of an ability to tell hard truths to yourself and to other people that actually makes you really valuable. So President Putin loved to look down on, hey, this guy's only a comedian who can play the piano with his penis in a skit and make people laugh. But that's what I would argue President Putin needs, a court jester. I think he's lacking, someone who can tell him hard truths. And if you look at President Zelensky as president, what did he get elected on? And what did he try to do? He was the peace candidate. Right, so Russia looks at this guy, 73% of Ukrainians want peace, which Russians view as surrender. Okay, you're the surrender candidate. Great. Okay, so of course they're not willing to fight, because this guy's just a peace candidate. And President Zelensky, rightly so, I was watching before the war started, and I couldn't understand why he was saying to everyone, this isn't going to happen, because U.S. intelligence was saying it was going to happen. And yeah, I understand why people don't trust U.S. intelligence. They've made a lot of mistakes throughout history. But open source intelligence was very clear, if you looked at the things that were going on Twitter and TikTok and all these things, that this was not just some exercise that the Russian army was engaging in. And I remember watching before the war, Michael Kaufman, the top analyst, the expert in Russian military affairs, and he said a couple weeks before the war, he said, well, here's what's going to happen. The war's going to happen because here's why President Putin's going to do it. And why President Zelensky's behaving the way he is, I don't understand it. I'm not going to comment on it. I mean, he was very critical of it, and I agreed, because I was saying to myself, why can't Ukraine's government tell the people the truth about what's about to happen? And President Zelensky, there's going to be a lot of, I think, post-war analysis of this, especially, could Ukraine have been more prepared? Could they have mobilized beforehand? Could they have, done more defensive preparations with the current military? Could they have warned people to get their families out of the country? There was a lot of debate about that. But he actually gave an in-depth interview to the Washington Post where he talked about this. And he said, look, we knew what was going to happen, but if you actually tell people what's going to happen, you can actually make an invasion unnecessary, because the panic, people leaving the country, the economy collapsing, that would have created an almost self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if he was right or wrong, did he handle it perfectly? I don't know. And history, the beautiful thing about history, the frustrating thing about history is you can't rewind it and try it again. But something I'd like to point out here is at President Zelensky's Munich conference, he flew on the 19th of February to Munich. All right, he flew there and he gave a speech. This is probably the last time you'll ever see the guy in a suit. And he gave a speech at the Munich conference, and I remember watching it. And it was so sad to watch President Zelensky basically begging President Putin, let's talk, right? People were worried his plane was going to get shot down because the war was supposed to have started on 14 February. It got delayed. And it was so sad for me to watch that, because you're thinking, man, this guy's begging to talk, and the war's about to happen. And he said, I'm ready to meet you, President Putin, wherever you are. Okay, now imagine another president from Ukraine who would have said, bring it on, we're ready. We've mobilized the army. We're at the borders, we're ready to fight you. Imagine that. And what is this role? This is refusal to call. I don't want to be a wartime president. Are you kidding me? I'm a comedian. And they did opinion polls right before the war. I think 35% of the country thought President Zelensky would be a good wartime leader. Like, this isn't the guy who would want in charge if a war starts. He's supposed to make peace. And if you think back to his behavior before the war, despite probably some of the initial setbacks it caused, especially around Kyiv and other regions, the military wasn't listening to their president. They were preparing. And you hear the chief of military intelligence, he told everyone right before the war, he told everyone, hey, this is going to happen. They knew well before. General Zaluzny, they weren't listening to President Zelensky. They were preparing. So whether or not they should have mobilized, the military knew this was coming. But my thesis, my argument about President Zelensky's behavior is instinctively, probably because he's a storyteller, he's a comedian, he understood the role he was playing, which is, if I act like I want this war, that I haven't done everything I can to prevent it, we're not going to get the support we need on the world stage, right? And playing this almost innocent lamb to the slaughter, very religious overtones, like sacrificial lamb, Christ-like if you're a Christian, or Judaic, sacrificial lamb, like the innocent lamb to the slaughter. That part of the story, I think, is critical to Ukraine's success. Because if you look at it, Who's Zelensky's mentor? Who's his Obi-Wan Kenobi? Boris Johnson. Do you know who Boris Johnson's idol is? He wrote a book on him, Winston Churchill. Right? And the British, and I'm proud to say this because my father's English, and I grew up reading books about Winston Churchill in World War II. They were actually really, really supportive of Ukraine, more so than the United States. Both in terms of equipment that they flooded into the country right before, but more importantly, morally. And I think the British, especially, he's very eloquent, did a lot of other things wrong as prime minister, but very eloquent. Boris Johnson rose to the occasion on this moment, found his inner Churchill in terms of standing on the right side of history. Churchill got a lot of things wrong throughout his career in government, but the one big thing he got right was calling out Hitler as evil. And Boris Johnson did the same thing. And he's like channeling Churchill as a mentor to Zelensky and saying, hey, you can do this. If the war starts, we're behind you, right? And that to me is like what gave Ukraine a huge amount of strength. I mean, British people, even to this day, Boris Johnson has like croissants and desserts named after him here in Kyiv. Really, he was like the Obi-Wan Kenobi of this story. And if you think about it, crossing the threshold, I talked about this last time, President Zelensky comes out of nowhere, and the second day of the war, when people are wondering if he'd fled the country, he'd been offered apparently a ride out of the country by the Brits, the Americans, whoever was offering him their planes or to get him out there with some special extraction. He said, no, I'm here. And everyone in my team is here and we're ready to fight. And it's like this head snap. And I remember watching this outside of the country. The guy that you're feeling sorry for that no one thought is going to be a wartime leader steps up. He says, okay, you want to fight. All right, let's fight. And that to me was a huge moment. And if you think about what happened when the war started, nobody, if you would have told anyone the amount of weapons that Ukraine was getting from the West 8 months into the war, no one would believe you before the war. I certainly wouldn't have believed you. And the reason why he got it, I believe, Ukraine ran out of artillery ammunition 6 weeks into the war. If they wouldn't have got artillery, new NATO standard artillery pieces and artillery ammunition, Kyiv would have fallen. Right? The whole country would have fallen. You would have run out of ammunition. Russia was completely outmatching Ukraine in terms of material. No amount of spirit is going to stand against a modern industrial army when you've completely run out of ammunition. Sticks, whatever you run out of bullets, you run out of javelins, you run out of all that stuff. Ukraine's not going to be able to withstand the Russian army. But President Zelensky's ability to tell such a powerful story on the world stage, giving speeches to parliaments and to the European Union and literally shaming the West into unlocking its arsenal of democracy, putting sanctions on Russia that no one ever expected they would do, that, to me, is what President Zelensky managed to accomplish by playing the role. As an actor, as a comedian, he instinctively played that role. And at the beginning, there's huge tests, but also allies and enemies here. And if you think about it, this is President Zelensky visiting Bucha on the 4th of April after the Battle of Kyiv has basically been won by the Ukrainians. The Russians retreat from the Battle of Kyiv. There's some initial success, a lot of euphoria over, hey, this Russian army's not so tough. But this is President Zelensky out there seeing the aftermath of the battle. And this is when negotiations stop. Because who's going to negotiate with a country that is committing atrocities? There's very little room for negotiation after they see that. And this is President Zelensky approaching the innermost cave. Now in June, there's a lot of euphoria in April, but in June, what happens? Or May and June, the Russian artillery starts pounding Ukraine, and this is before modern Ukrainian artillery is or modern Western NATO standard artillery is getting into the country. And President Zelensky says something that was really interesting. He said, we are in for some really difficult times. He told the country, it is hell in the Donbass. We're in for some really difficult times. And this was an interesting part to me, because one of the big things about stories that makes them powerful is truth. All stories are untrue, but they need to be based on facts. And what happened here is President Zelensky and his administration started to say some really shocking things. We're losing 100 soldiers killed a day, 150, anywhere between 1 and 200. And that was shocking. And that's something that we were surprised that Ukrainians would be that transparent. Are they even inflating those numbers? Who knows? But he was honest with the people, but also his allies. This is hard. This is difficult. And I think that was really important for generating more support, generating more weapons shipments in, and also being straight with the Ukrainian people that, hey, don't expect this war to be easy. Just because we won the Battle of Kyiv, it doesn't mean we've won the war. And that was President Zelensky there visiting the frontline units. He goes out to a town that's under complete artillery bombardment from the Russian forces, and he visits the soldiers on the front line. And that's a very powerful story. Hey, I'm willing to actually go visit my frontline soldiers. What is President Putin doing? Sitting behind massive tables, so his general and secretary of defense or his chief of staff can't even sit next to him because he's that paranoid about people. So visually, very powerful. And then the ordeal. Look at where we are right now. This is 10 October, right after the missile strikes here in downtown Kyiv. Even after some initial successes recently in Kharkiv and also in Kherson, Ukraine's actually getting into the real transformational part of this war, which is going to get tougher before it gets better. Okay, Russia just fired their general again, who's in charge of the war. They put this guy named General Armageddon in charge, who's basically one of the toughest in terms of his treatment of civilians that Russia's ever had. In command recently in the war in Syria, and he just unleashes a furious missile barrage across Ukraine and kills a bunch of civilians, knocks out power across the country. And he's saying, hey, this is going to get even more difficult. They're targeting us. They're targeting our power. Cultural symbols, Taras Shevchenko University targeted, and us specifically. And our power. They are terrorizing us, and that's what's coming. And it's going to be a very difficult winter ahead. So our president of Ukraine, is an instinctual storyteller, and he's played the part perfectly. Obviously, he's made mistakes. But in terms of his role as a storyteller, every single day giving talks to the people, telling them what's going on, not hiding from hard truths about casualties, about the hard times ahead. He's played the role well. And there's been some interesting criticism on Twitter where people are saying, hey, don't you think you should be spending less time on camera, selling a bunch of people on this? Shouldn't you spend more time running your military? No, you're president of the country. Your job through a war is to tell the story to the people. And anyone who's, if you think about it, in peacetime, his skills are not nearly as useful as they are during wartime. Who would have thought comedian's the best preparation for a wartime leader? So let's go through the levels of war and storytelling, because storytelling in war fits into war broadly as a narrative. This is a picture of Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin at the Yalta conference in Crimea, right before the end of the war. And one of the really interesting parts of war and strategy is understanding that war happens at different levels. And understanding the level of war that you're participating in from a story perspective is important. And one of the things that Hitler as we talked about in the last lesson, tactically, the German army always gave more than it got in terms of casualties. They, man for man, dished out a tremendous amount of casualties to the Soviet army, to the American army, to the British army, compared to what they absorbed themselves. They were tactically the best army of World War II. Operationally, the Germans came in and they unleashed this new form of mechanized warfare, popularly known as blitzkrieg, that still to this day underpins thinking in Western militaries. The Ukrainian tradition, which they've inherited or taken from both the Soviet army but also from the NATO army, basically blends right now the best of German tactics from World War II that were brought into NATO, and then the best of Soviet doctrine, which the Soviet army got really good by the end of the war at countering what was basically the best army the world had ever seen in terms of modern warfare, the German army. So why did Germany lose the war? They were brilliant campaign strategists. They were, brilliant at campaigns. They conquered France in 6 weeks. Operation Barbarossa, they inflict 3 million casualties on the Soviet Union in the first months of the war. Why did they lose? Because they lost the strategic picture. The Allies won the war strategically. All right? So we're going to go through the levels of war here. And what is the strategic level of war? The strategic level of war, this is a picture of President Zelensky addressing the European Union on the 1st of March, just 5 days after the war started. Ukraine has strategically won the war since the beginning when President Zelensky gets European Union backing, European Union membership. Okay, now NATO countries, when Russia escalates, okay, you're going to hit Kyiv, we're just going to send modern air defense systems in. We're going to send more HIMARS in. We're going to send more weapons in. And he won that strategic battle at the very beginning of the war in terms of getting the West to unite around supporting Ukraine. Now, that's not something to take for granted. President Zelensky is constantly working on that. He's constantly, just the other day, he gets on a call with the G7 leaders in reaction to the rocket attacks on Kyiv. That is where the fight is, because Ukraine without Western support is going to lose the war. But right now, it's managed to win from the very beginning of the war Western support. And it's managed to maintain that. And the more Russia escalates, the more Western support Ukraine's able to. Now, that is something to not take for granted. This war is not over. You can still lose the war, but right now they're winning strategically. Resources, the will of the population, 91% approval rating of President Zelensky, something like 90+% of Ukrainians do not want to negotiate with Russia. They want complete territorial restoration of Ukraine, 1991 boundaries. I mean, that is strategy. The strategy is the home front. It is the resources, industrially, weapons, the intelligence, the alliances. That's where wars are won and lost. And you can have a really, really great army that can do amazing things on the battlefield like the Germans in World War II, but the Germans were always outproduced. They were outproduced by the Soviet Union. So that is where the war is won and lost. That is strategy. And if you think about stories at a strategic level, President Zelensky talking to leaders, he's talking to Boy Scout groups. He'll talk to anyone on Zoom, right? He'll jump in there and make a speech because he understands the importance of strategic communications and strategic storytelling. Keeping the Allies on side, keeping the Allies supporting Ukraine is the key to victory for Ukraine. That's the strategic fight. And that's where President Putin and the Russians have lost so badly with their assumptions about Western unity, Western resolve, and Ukraine's ability to garner that. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion at the beginning of the war. Ukraine had to win. They had to show, no one likes to back a loser. They had to win. They had to give Russia a bloody nose at the beginning. They had to win the Battle of Kyiv to get the long-term support that they're getting. But that was not a foregone conclusion. And that's because President Zelensky, from the beginning of the war, stepped into his role as a strategic storyteller. Now, this is operational, is The operational level of war is campaigns. And campaigns are broad offensives that really are usually led by generals, almost always led by generals, sometimes little bit lesser ranked, but it usually involves tens of thousands of soldiers. And campaigns can be smaller than that, but generally a campaign is like the Kharkiv offensive, where 10 plus thousand soldiers takes back several thousand square miles or square kilometers of territory. And this is General Syrskyi, the head of Land Forces Command of Ukraine, visiting the troops at the front line with President Zelensky. Again, with an eye towards storytelling, President Zelensky goes out and visits the troops at the front, right after they've liberated critical territory. So the operational level of war, another example of that right now is the Kherson offensive. Several, tens of thousands of troops on both sides, and it's a campaign. It's a series of battles that are put together to achieve a high-level strategic objective. Getting back Kherson for Ukraine is going to be a strategic blow to Putin. It's basically, you just annexed this city. It's the only major city you've annexed, and you're going to lose it. That's not foregone, but analysts think that Ukraine eventually will prevail in the Battle of Kherson, or this offensive to recapture that city and the whole right bank of the river. And Russian military generals apparently do not want to defend Kherson. Militarily, it's very difficult. Logistically, it's almost impossible because Ukraine keeps bombing the bridges. So Russia is going to lose logistically. They're just going to run out of supplies, run out of people before Ukraine does in that campaign. And actually, what really makes offensives successful is not the quality of the soldiers, but there's this old saying that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics, or amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. You can be a great warfighter, but if you run out of bullets, you're done, okay? And logistical planning and planning supplies and making sure that your army's supplied, you have the right resources because you're doing the right things strategically to get weapons in the country, but getting those into the hands of soldiers during a big offensive is really the operational art, is logistics. Making sure that your army has the right equipment, the right weapon systems, the right amount of ammunition to accomplish a big objective like the reconquest of Kherson. And then tactical. And tactical is where the soldiers on the ground are shooting at each other. And this is just a picture of soldiers on the front lines in Donbass. And this can be a battle of just a dozen or so soldiers, several thousand soldiers in some kind of battle. But this is where soldiers are in direct contact with each other. That is a tactical level of war. Artillery, direct firing at each other, all the drones, anything along the front line where you go to the line of contact, that is a tactical level of war. And if you think about stories in war, stories that get global media attention, even if it's a tactical event, that becomes a global story. That can become a strategic story. So anything that only circulates among people on the front line, like, hey, there's this drone over here that's, really doing a lot of damage, that becomes a story tactically, okay? Soldiers telling each other stories, or some interaction of stories between soldiers and the people right there. They all know what's going on, something's happening, right? Artillery barrages are stories. Violence is a story. It's saying, hey, get out of here. This place isn't safe. You're not safe. The armed forces of Ukraine cannot protect your village. That's a story. That's a message. Okay, we're going to bomb you here. That's a story. The strike on Kyiv the other day was a strategic story. It was a strategic story to the people of Ukraine. You're not safe anywhere, and you're going to freeze this winter. Okay, so violence creates stories. The reaction towards violence, the media attention that it gets across the world, is a story. And violence is designed in war to send messages. Stop resisting. You guys are Russian. You just didn't know it. Okay, Ukraine doesn't exist as a country. We're going to show you. That's Russia's message with their violence. And Ukraine has a very different story. We're Cossacks. We're never going to submit. We'd rather die than live under Russian domination. So these are all stories. And I want to talk about something that's very important to understand is propaganda in war. Propaganda or information operations. In America or in the West, we don't like to say propaganda because that reminds us of this guy, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Germany. Propaganda is information that a party to the conflict wants you to receive. Governments put it out, militaries put it out, local administrations, politicians. Everything they say is basically propaganda. What President Zelensky says is the story he's telling or doesn't tell you is the message of the Ukrainian government. And one of the things that made Joseph Goebbels such an effective propaganda minister was the German army, when they were successful, they were really, really good at telling the truth. I mean, everyone loves to tell the truth when you're winning. Hey, here's some newsreels of victories, and that's easy. But when the war started to turn, Joseph Goebbels actually was really, really good at having this iron grip on information and was able to spin defeats and keep the German home front behind the war, keep Germans motivated to keep fighting to the bitter end. So propaganda is very effective, and you see this in Russia. They've completely taken over. They've eliminated independent journalism, or that's what they're trying to do, and they've taken over the Russian media outlets, TASS specifically. They've come in and cleaned house and basically told the editors what to do. In totalitarian societies, propaganda is really powerful because they basically come in and they eliminate anyone who questions the narrative of the state. And that can keep countries fighting a lot longer than they should if they knew the truth. Now, in Russia, there's something interesting that you have this military blogosphere, Telegram channels where I guess they haven't figured out how to shut these guys up. But most of the Telegram channels are actually more pro-war than actually the government is. So they're just honest about the defeats that are happening on the front and calling for more extreme measures from the Russian government. And President Putin has actually been forced to focus on, that's probably one of the main reasons why Russia mobilized, is the people who are telling the truth about the war that are causing such a big drama inside Russian society are actually the pro-war camp. They're just saying, hey, we're losing. We need to ratchet it up. We need to draft everyone. So propaganda is very powerful, especially in a totalitarian society. In the West, we don't ever there's no propaganda ministry in the Ukrainian government, but effectively the information that the armed forces puts out or doesn't put out, that keeps from us, the government puts out, it's a form of propaganda. We just call it something else. Information operations is what it's called in the army. That's your narrative as a party to the conflict. And then you've got journalism in war. Now this is a photo, very famous photo in 2004 of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, where a couple of prison guards, this girl Lindy Williams and some other people, she was the famous one because it was a scandal that this female soldier was putting Iraqi men, Arab men, in humiliating positions, like naked, stacked up in pyramids, and all kinds of, gross mistreatment of prisoners. And I remember when this broke, we were in Iraq, and the Bush administration went to CBS, 60 Minutes, and was going to break this story. They said, you cannot put this story out there. You cannot put this story out there. It is going to get our soldiers killed. There was this huge tension about this story, and CBS put it out there anyway, because in American media, they said, well, what are you going to do to us, right? We're just going to put it out there. And we weren't formally declared war. There weren't so many restrictions on the media that the Bush administration couldn't stop it. But this caused a huge scandal in America. And I remember in 2007 and 2008, I was talking to Iraqis who told me, I signed up to start fighting you when I saw these pictures. I mean, this really caused a lot of heartache for the American army. But actually looking back, I think this was probably the best thing that had ever happened to the war effort. It clashed with the propaganda our government was saying. And our government before that was saying, hey, Iraq's going well, we're winning. And the media started saying, no, you're not. You're not winning. You're not winning. And they actually created problems with us, for us, by publishing this. This created a huge amount of violence and an uprising in Iraqi society. But what it did was it also caused Senator John McCain and a bunch of other people in our government to say, hey, what are we doing to prisoners in Iraq? Okay, what on earth would allow something like this to happen? This is not right morally. And this isn't how you win wars. If you mistreat your enemy, or the people that are rising up to fight against you, you're occupying their country anyway. If you mistreat them, that's a problem. And long term, that's going to create a lot more problems for you than if you fix that rot within your system. So when there were videos early on in the war of potential Ukrainian atrocities against Russian soldiers, I hope those were investigated, right? And one of the things that Ukrainian military and society needs to understand is it's very hard to not stoop to the level of your enemy, but you have to resist that urge, especially in a free society that has media that can investigate and fight back against some of those things. And this was something that was really important. And that's the tension that always exists in war, is a free media can force a military to do better and can force a government to make itself better, as painful as it is to look at yourself in the mirror. The role of the comedian or the court jester is almost the role that the media plays in war. And it's hard to be critical of your own government inside a war, and sometimes there's laws against certain things. But that tension between a media that holds a government accountable while also being clearly biased towards wanting their country to win in a war is important. And one of the things that in World War II made the Allies so much stronger was their free media, their ability to criticize the governments. The raid at Dieppe in 1942 that was disastrous on the French coast. A lot of criticism, even in World War II, when they had these laws, we're at war. The media in the West was much better at holding its governments to account, seeing problems, oversight, making sure politicians were doing their job. What tends to happen with dictators when they control everything and the propaganda is you can actually create fantasy for yourself. Well, actually, there's nothing bad happening because all I hear is good news from my generals, and there's no media that's going to question that. And that's the tension that's going on right now in Russia, is their relationship to the truth. There was a Russian Duma state member, some general, who said, we've got to stop lying to ourselves and to each other, or we're going to lose this war. And that goes back to stories. Is your story true? No, but is it at least trying to be based on facts? Or is it just complete flights of fancy? Right? And that's why storytelling is so important, is telling the truth to yourself about what's happening and making something useful of the truth. Setbacks, like President Zelensky's not been afraid to say when Ukraine's been facing setbacks, but what are we going to do about it? What's the solution? What's the story that we need to tell ourselves to get through this? I need to go get more weapons from the West. You guys need to hold strong. Help is on the way. So, there's different stories in war. There's stories in society, okay? And this is the missile strike 650 meters from my apartment the other day that woke me and my wife up. That told a global story. People from all over the world were messaging us saying, are you guys okay? Checking in on us, and that told a global story. Also told a local story in the local people that lived in that neighborhood. There's a story, there's a narrative. What were you doing when you heard that? Okay, how did that affect you personally? How do you feel based on that? And we tell each other these stories. We talk to each other about what happened. Some people are leaving the country because of it. Some people are just more upset and doing certain things, but we're all integrating and processing that event differently. And so is the local community, so is the city of Kyiv, so is the country, and all different cities are going through this differently. And every day, certain cities are just being completely bombarded, and we don't hear about it at all because it's just old news, or there's no attention on it. But Kyiv specifically gets a lot of global attention. You have national media. Obviously, Ukrainians understand far better than anyone else what's going on because you're living it every day. There's a national media focus on this. But then there's the global media. What happens based on this event? More air defense shipped, more sanctions, whatever the case is, all these things are different. Then you have social media, which is one tweet can go from a personal story to a national story to a global story very quickly. And these are the stories that society tells in war. And then you have stories by or for or on governments. And this is where you have different parts of the government tell different stories. This is actually a picture of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade from the Ukrainian Army, which just happened to be Ilya Ponomarenko, the famous war reporter from Kyiv Independent. I was sitting down with him and I was talking to him about the Battle of Kyiv. He said, we're really lucky that the 72nd Brigade was here in the Battle of Kyiv because they're the best brigade in the Army. I always used to love going out with those guys the most because they're just the best fighters. And they just happened to be back in Kyiv when the war started, and their job was to defend the capital. Their base is right outside of Kyiv in Bilatsyrka, southwest of Kyiv, and it was their job to defend the capital. But they were outnumbered 12-1 against Russian forces on the west side of Kyiv. So units, they all have their own internal stories, their own legends. The patch President Zelensky was wearing when he went to Izium was the patch of the 72nd Brigade, Ukraine or death, right? And all of these different stories that units have that they tell themselves, that they tell the rest of the country. Elected officials, Mayor Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Kim, the governor of Mykolaiv region, all of these people from the government. Now, this would be classified as propaganda because it's put out by the government, but they all have stories they're putting out there. They make themselves available to the media to do feature stories on them. That becomes journalism. But then they put out on their own social media channel what they want to project, that propaganda, that information. And only when there's a match between each side can you create this. When the story that society and government are telling, are matching, are working together, that's when you can keep going in war. But when you can't do that, when there's such a mismatch between what you're being told and what you're actually seeing and experiencing, what military units are telling their loved ones back on the front, or what they see happening to their loved ones from refugee situations or bombardments, when those two things work together, what the people are hearing from each other and what they're telling each other matches what they're hearing from their government, and there's general honesty between them, general respect for the truth, societies can go and go during war. All right, so this brings me back to all of you here who are in this class. If you're watching this video and you're not part of the journalism class that I'm teaching, their final project is to create a story that we're going to put out on the Borderlands Foundation website about a veteran or someone who's been impacted by the war, whether they lived through a traumatic event or in certain battles or whatever you choose to highlight. These are the different types of stories you can tell, and you have to decide if you're going to feature a person, a unit, a commander, President Zelensky, if you can get to him, whoever you choose to interview. You want to create a video. And this is actually a video that was created, and as a veteran, this is something that's really important, is you live through a lot when you're in a combat situation. And then eventually you have to kind of condense in your mind what happened and crystallize that and tell yourself an empowering story to get through the rest of your life about it. That's basically what happens to anyone who's been in combat. If you've not been in combat, but you've just lived through a war like all of you are, every Ukrainian has to tell yourself a story to get through this war and to have an empowering, better rest of your life, right? Everyone has that. And certain people, unfortunately, who didn't sign up for it, live through traumatic events like what happened the other day in the bombing or other things, and you have to tell yourself a story. And my question to all of you is, what story are you going to tell? What is your story you're going to tell and put in a short video that's going to allow a veteran or someone who's experienced this war to have an empowering story? Okay, so this is actually a video. I'll just show you an example of when I was in Iraq that was done by a Washington Post video team where they featured our unit because Tom Ricks, who's a best-selling author who wrote a book about Iraq that was a bestseller, he emailed me and said, hey, I want to hear some stories about the war that were interesting for you. And I emailed him back this story, and they decided to write it up in the book and then create this video for the book launch of the Washington Post. So I'll play this for you, and this hopefully will give you all some inspiration on the story that you're going to create for your class project.
Toolbox wiring. Hey, y'all start calling the other room. Taxi sign.
Negotiating with the insurgents on a personal level was probably one of the most surreal experiences of my life. And many of these meetings it's all the same memory, which is a dark room with an oil lantern in the middle of the table. And in the middle of the night, a man comes to the gate and he's searched, and then we bring him in. The tendency in the United States Army is to want to solve problems immediately. And in an insurgency, that's just not possible. When we started negotiations, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not this was the right approach. This was a very risky strategy that I felt was worth the risk. As a commander, when you take on risk, you have to evaluate the potential payoff for engaging those risks. For example, once we met with a member of Al-Qaeda. 2 weeks later, based on intelligence he provided, we were able to surround and kill the top target in our area. Yeah, you don't sleep that well afterwards, but it takes you a little bit of time to unwind. I think I had a few nights of just sporadic sleep afterwards, and then you move on. The United States had made a lot of mistakes in the beginning of the occupation that caused the insurgency. And when I made that acknowledgement, that was a very important point for them psychologically. It was no longer something that was beneficial to themselves and their families, and it was time to move on. The town hall meeting actually happened because the Iraqis, inspired by our example, came up with the idea, and they said, we need to have a mass amnesty program. And as I sat there on the stage, one of the leaders of Al-Qaeda, who we'd been talking to, was the keynote speaker. And I sat there and watched him speak, telling the people that we needed to embrace reconciliation. And even though I don't understand a lot of Arabic, I realized that it was happening, that it was an Iraqi initiative, and that we had to embrace it. About 3 or 4 months after reconciliation, some of our soldiers were invited to go out and dance there. You gotta know, but on a Thursday afternoon, you're gonna hear a lot of gunfire, and you can't just go thinking it's a fight because it's probably a wedding, because wedding parties love to shoot in Iraq.
So that's the mission of the Borderlands Foundation, is to create something for veterans who've experienced a lot that gives them meaning for what they've done and what they've sacrificed and what they've experienced. And there was a written article, which I'll share with you, and then that video, which came out. It's funny, my dad loves to read that and share that with people. But I think it's important that everyone in Ukraine, and with your help and the people working in our center that we're going to recruit into the center to volunteer to help develop these stories, gives everyone who wants to tell their story for posterity, for family, for whoever, the chance to share their experiences. And that's really the vision and the motivation for the Borderlands Foundation. This is actually my friend Yuri. The second day of the war, he used to serve on the front lines in the Donbass in 2015. I interviewed him, not knowing how the war was going to go, but we started doing a series of interviews as the war started from February and March and April. That's actually on my Facebook page and the YouTube channel, the Borderlands YouTube channel. You can go hear a lot of these interviews with people that we talked to as the war was starting. Unfortunately, Yuri has lost, because he hires a lot of veterans, he's lost 3 of his employees to the war, and a good friend of his also, in fact, Dennis Antipov, who I met also, is one of the people who lost their lives in this war. And I think their stories, especially those who've died, deserve to be told for the benefit of their families, to have some memories, interviewing them, their comrades, their families, about who this person was, so that they're not forgotten, and so that they're not forgotten. And I think I'll end with this. Why do men and women willingly lay down their lives in war? It's something that's really fascinating as a historian, as someone who used to be in the military, who experienced, seeing my soldiers run into combat fearlessly, and I trained them to do that, which was quite scary. It's like watching your children go into a dangerous situation. Why do they do that? And the reason why they do that is because stories. And how do we live forever? You live through the stories that you create in your life. And people are willing to literally do something that will cost them their lives because they know that they'll be remembered for that. And that's what's going to create victory in Ukraine is the number of people who are willing to die for an idea, for a cause, for a story that your president, I think, is telling really well, will create a victory. And that's what the Borderlands Foundation is designed to do, is perpetuate and tell those stories in a powerful way. So that's why your final project is to create a video and a written piece that tells the story of people who are literally creating the future with their actions in this war. Right? So thank you very much. I'll be back next time for talking about the first set of 9 principles on war, which is going to be the storytelling principles, the 3 principles that make up storytelling, more mechanics and examples of storytelling in war. That will be the next lecture. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time. Hi, my name is Sam Cook, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Borderlands Foundation. And the video you're just watching is part of a series that I'm delivering to the students at Kyiv's top university, the Kyiv Mohyla Academy, in the Master's Department of Journalism, where we're talking about war and storytelling and the power that it has to create a better future for Ukraine and the world with what's happening here. And if you'd like to learn more about the history and the future of Ukraine, you can watch this whole series of lectures that I'm delivering. They're all available for you free out there online on YouTube, or you can sign up to get them emailed to you, and I'd love to get your feedback on all of these series. Now, if you're wondering what the Borderlands Foundation is, I'd like to give you a little bit of background and let you know how you can support our work. The Borderlands Foundation started right after the war. I've been living in Ukraine since 2018. That's where I met my wife, and we evacuated my tech company and some of the members of my media company to safety before and after the war started. And in the process of helping people get out of the danger zone of the fighting, we ended up raising a bunch of money to support our internal team, and we ended up using the money we had left over to help a lot of people who are trying to get to safety in Ukraine. And with that, a charity was born, a nonprofit called the Borderlands Foundation. And as it evolved, we started interviewing a lot of people in the beginning who were impacted by the war, sharing their stories online with live broadcasts and recordings we put out. We decided we wanted to create an enduring foundation with this nonprofit where people who experienced the war, who lived through the war, can tell their stories, to give themselves a sense of closure, to tell their story to their family and hopefully to people long after they're gone who can access it and use it as a research center where people who experienced the war can tell their story for history, for the sake of creating a unified, strong national identity and an example to the rest of the world who cares about what's going on in Ukraine and what it means is possible for the rest of us in terms of their inspiration for fighting for democracy and freedom and for creating a better society that we can all model. So that's the mission of the Borderlands Foundation. If you'd like to support us, I'd really like you to go to our website and really support the people who created the history and the story that is the inspiration to all of us about Ukraine. Watch the videos of the people that we featured, see who they are, those that inspire you or move you, donate directly to them. And when you do that, when you donate directly to them to support them, you can also choose to support the Borderlands Foundation too by donating some money to us and allowing us to create more videos and create more stories for our research center and to support the people who have created this history, this powerful story that's attracting all of us and giving us an example of what's possible. So thanks again for watching. Watch the rest of the lecture series. And if you're inspired, watch the stories of the people that we feature on our website, donate directly to them and to the Borderlands Foundation so we can keep producing and telling the story of Ukraine, the history of this war and the future that they can create from it for all of us.